Hello, Brit Fanatics. I'm here today with the upcoming LEGO architecture set 21063 at Neuschwanstein Castle. It's set to launch on August 1st for $239.99 in the UK and is available to pre-order now on lego.com. At 3,455 pieces, it's the second largest LEGO architecture set to ever exist, beaten only by last year's Notre Dame. This set has some special significance to me personally because not only did I live for a year in Bavaria where the real castle is located, but I actually worked as a tour guide for this castle. So I was taking tourists from Munich, a nearby city, to the castle itself. Although a lot of the job was discussing history and some spooky stories to do with the castle, 90% of the job was just telling tourists that yes, the last train is at 4:25, and yes, I will leave you behind if you make the rest of the group late. More than 1.3 million people visit the castle every year, making it one of Germany's biggest tourist attractions, something that would make its royal designer turn in his grave. I have always found King Ludwig of Bavaria's story both tragic and fascinating, and while building the set, I couldn't help but feel that parts of his personality have made it not just into the real-life castle, but into this LEGO version of it as well. It all starts with a sensitive prince who turned into an eclectic king. Ludwig was a sensitive young boy. He spent a lot of time outside of the city and outside of the court, growing up in Hohenschwangau, which is the region where Neuschwanstein would one day stand. He became king of Bavaria at the age of 19 in the year 1864, but almost immediately he's made himself quite an unusual and an unliked king. Where the expectation was for him to stay in the court in Munich, he much preferred being away from big crowds and formal engagements and spent a lot of time in the countryside. The king was also, like many young kings, under pressure to produce an heir. He was actually engaged to his cousin. We won't go into that here, it was normal for the time, but he postponed the wedding so many times that her father eventually just called the whole thing off. Ludwig would in fact never marry, and many historians have speculated that he might have been gay. This is especially due to the fact that he had a lot of close relationships with male artists and musicians, most notably the composer Richard Wagner, who we'll come back to later. Of course, due to the time he lived in, there's no confirmation of his sexual orientation, but people have speculated. However, his relationship with Wagner in particular was close enough that Neuschwanstein Castle actually includes a lot of tributes to the composer's work. Just a few years into his reign in 1869, Ludwig began to have this idea of a private residence that he could enjoy in the area of Hohenschwangau, away from the court and away from all of the formal engagements and big parties that he didn't like. His youth in the countryside was perhaps where he was happiest in his life, and he wanted to recapture some of that youthful joy. Arguably, he could also have been looking for a private residence away from the prying eyes of the court that he can engage in relationships as he pleased. Using his personal funds, with some heavy debts taken from the royal coffers, he began construction on Neuschwanstein Castle, tearing down the two medieval castles that had been stood on that spot. In September 1869, the first stones were laid, but it wasn't until 1882 that Ludwig could actually move in, at least partially, to start overseeing the construction works. The castle would in fact take a long time to build. Ludwig had very exacting tastes and would often change his mind in flights of fancy. Contractors would start to build the floor of a ballroom, and he would change his mind and decide it had to be a totally different structure. He asked for architectural input from designers across Europe. He really wanted this palace to be his life's work, and to get that done, he was very, very precise. This is especially where I can see Ludwig's personality come through in the LEGO set, as you build different sections at different times. You might start here at the front when you think you're going to build all the way up to the roof, and then suddenly you're jumping through to the courtyard. To me, knowing what I know about Ludwig's life, it does feel like it's taking parts of his sort of erratic behavior and weaving them into the LEGO set. His fascination with Wagner's operas was also very much incorporated into the real castle, and some of that can be seen in the LEGO set as well. Even the name Neuschwanstein, which translates to Neuschwanstein, is a reference to an opera. Ludwig's favourite opera of Wagner's was The Lohengrin, a tale about a knight who came to rescue a damsel in distress, the classic story, but he swore only to do it if she never asked about his name or his origins. Of course, she did, and he told her that he was one of the knights searching for the Holy Grail. Because she had asked, he then had to leave her forever, leaving the poor damsel heartbroken. You can perhaps see some parallels to the engagement that Ludwig broke off. He did tend to see himself as this romantic knight ideal. You can see a lot of that imagery woven into the castle with all the swan imagery and the lion imagery that's all over the castle. That's also in the LEGO set, although it's hidden underneath the bricks, so you only really see it when you're building it. You can't really see it once it's fully complete. In 1884, Ludwig formally moved into the part of the palace that was now complete, making it his official residence. That is the red section of the castle that you can see at the front. However, construction was far from complete, and King Ludwig would eventually spend double his original budget on the castle. That came to 6.2 million German marks, the equivalent of around 43 million euros today. Despite that investment and all the time he spent at the castle, he would never see it complete. I did promise you a spooky story after all. The lack of an heir, the extravagant spending, and the refusal to spend much time in court made Ludwig a pretty unpopular king. So unpopular, in fact, that his advisors started plotting to replace him with his uncle, Prince Leopold. One of those people, Count Maximilian von Hohenstein, started gathering gossip and tales about the king to try and discredit him and have him declared legally insane. This would therefore make him unfit to rule. It was a pretty easy jump to make because a lot of royals in Europe at the time were insane. He was about to marry his cousin, there was a lot of inbreeding, and it was sort of just came with the territory. His younger brother Otto had already been declared insane, so this was sort of par for the course. In June 1896, the Count had managed to gather 4 psychiatrists who were willing to make a report, only one of which had ever actually met the king. The report read, "Suffering from such a disorder, freedom of action can no longer be allowed, and your majesty is declared incapable of ruling, which incapacity will be not only for a year's duration, but for the length of your majesty's life." Not good. At 4 a.m. on June 10th, a commission was sent to Neuschwanstein to take Ludwig into custody and remove him from power. However, his loyal coachman Fritz Osterholzer gave the king enough time to take measures into his own hands. He commanded the local police to barricade the castle and arrest the men coming to get them. There was even stories of a loyal 47-year-old baroness who tried to hit the men with her umbrella and then ran to the king's bedchamber to warn him. Whether it was the guns or whether it was the umbrella, we'll never really know, but the men were arrested, put into custody, but then eventually released. Ludwig, knowing that his power was under threat, attempted to rally support from the local people. He put out a notice in the paper calling on any loyal Bavarians to come forth and defend their king. However, his detractors squashed this printing, and not many people see it. The ones who did were able to be subdued pretty easily. The local policemen who were guarding the castle were then also replaced by soldiers who were loyal to the people trying to push Ludwig out of power. With those soldiers in place, Ludwig was ultimately arrested and moved to a castle away from Neuschwanstein, just a little bit further down the hill. Now here's where it gets a little strange. Ludwig had always been a very active man. He loved to swim, he loved to horse ride, and although he loved the arts, he was very physically fit. The doctor who had actually met Ludwig before was endeavouring to treat what he thought was his insanity. He took him out for walks around the area of Lake Starnberg near the castle, and when he came back from one the next day in the morning, he was very positive to the servants about thinking that Ludwig could be cured, could be treated, and perhaps even could return to power. However, it was not meant to be. In the evening of that same day, the pair went out for a walk around 6:30. They were expected to be back by 8 p.m, but they never returned. Searches were made, and eventually both bodies were found late in that night. Both men had drowned in shallow water that barely came up to their waists. Ludwig's death was officially ruled a suicide. However, that decision has been up for debate pretty much ever since. The king was a strong swimmer, and he knew that lake very well. There was no water found in his lungs in the post-mortem, and on the doctor's body there was bruising around his head and neck, which suggests strangulation. Many theories speculate that the king and the doctor were both killed to ensure a smooth transition of power. Others wonder whether maybe the king attacked the doctor in an attempt to escape and then drowned in the lake. Although, remember, no water in the lungs and pretty shallow water. At the end of the day, we'll never really know what happened. Neuschwanstein stands today as a tribute to the late king and all his eccentricities. It was finally finished 6 years after his death, once the construction was free from his changing mind. Although Ludwig had always intended it to be a private residence, it was open to the public just 6 weeks after his death, something he would have hated. It's been a tourist attraction ever since, and although it's not what he would have wanted to do with it, his character is definitely present throughout the castle and the artworks that are woven into it. Neuschwanstein is best seen from afar, and the Lego set really captures the amazing view you can get of it from the surrounding hills. I personally like to think that Ludwig would have loved to see his castle made into a Lego set. After all, he was always trying to tweak and change it, and that is considerably easier and cheaper to do with Lego bricks. I challenge you to create a Lego pick-a-brick order, which comes to more than 43 million euros. Considering how much he liked to tinker with architecture and how creative he was, I like to think he would have enjoyed this. If you want to follow in his footsteps and build your very own Neuschwanstein Castle, this time to completion, you can do so by pre-ordering it at lego.com. If you do pre-order it or buy anything else at lego.com, please consider using the links in the description down below or on the QR code on the screen now. It doesn't cost you any extra, but it kicks a little bit back to us so we can continue creating the Lego content that we love. Thank you for watching and letting me waffle about King Ludwig and his wild life for the first time in years. Have a good one.